I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, this is Steve.
Hi, this is Cara.
And we'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Innkeepers podcast. Today we're spending some time with Lynn Paulsen, and Lynn is the founder and service provider for CarePort Counseling. Lynn has spent over 20 years working overseas. I know several of those years, many of those years, she was involved in translation work in Thailand, and she has since transitioned into doing online missionary counseling.
So Lynn went to the University of California in San Diego as an engineering major, but then after several variations on the engineering theme, she ended up actually with a psychology degree. So after her many years serving overseas with Wycliffe doing Bible translation work, and she went back to school and went to Wheaton College, and she had some amazing mentors and wonderful training there that allowed her to be prepared to do missionary care. So she has been a licensed counselor since 2002, and we're really excited to have her on our show today.
Yeah, and I think Lynn's experiences on the field as a missionary, and then her training in counseling, her living in a large city, living in a small village, and traveling throughout Europe and Africa and Asia has really prepared her to be a person that can understand the needs of missionaries and listen to missionaries.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of meeting Lynn at the Care Connection conference in Portland in 2012, and we just really hit it off. Our shared training as counselors and our mutual passion for missionary care gave us a wonderful just point of connection, and it has been really good to have her as a colleague and a friend, and I'm so looking forward for you getting to know her a little bit and hearing her story. She's definitely a friend of the ministry of Sanctuary Inn, and we are just pleased that you get to know her today, too.
Yeah, so let's jump into that interview with Lynn. Well, today on the Innkeepers podcast, we're grateful to have Lynn Paulsen joining us. And Lynn, share a little bit about your story. I know you grew up in California, but that doesn't tell us a lot.
Well, yeah, actually I was born in Iowa and moved to California as a toddler. Grew up in a, I would say, nominally Christian household. So went to church, but really didn't hear the gospel till much later. I did not grow up with dreams of going overseas, vision for being a missionary, none of that. I actually went to college as an engineering major. But due to some significant events in my life, one particular one being my dad committing suicide, I switched to psychology in my junior year of college and really wanted to understand people, understand how to care for people. And the prayer of my life at that time was, Lord, how do I love people better? So then it was in college that I actually took a class at my church on missions because, someday I might want to support missionaries.
You didn't know you might be.
I didn't want to go.
Yeah.
I had no desire to do it myself. But I took a class, and the teacher told us about a woman who was coming to the area and doing speaking about particularly Wycliffe Bible translators, but her work in the Philippines. And the teacher told us about where she'd be, what dates, etc. And I was humming and hawing, and that night thinking, do I want to go? No, I don't really want to go. I don't really want to go out. And so finally, I did go. And I went, and this woman was showing her slides. That was a while ago.
I've been to many a slide presentation.
Yes.
But it turned out to be her, a couple of other Wycliffe people, and me. I was the only one that showed up to this presentation.
Wow.
So she showed her slides and then said, "So, any questions?" And of course, I'm wanting to look over my shoulder at everyone else, but it was just me. So at that point, I didn't have any questions. I wasn't interested in this, it wasn't going to be about me. But then a few weeks later, I was at church, and in the evening, there was a missionary speaking. And, it was interesting, but again, I didn't feel moved or anything. But afterwards, the pastor gave what I would call an altar call for missions. And again, I sat firmly in my seat and realized that I was having this internal argument going on saying, "No, that's not me. I couldn't do that. No way. And then my friend next to me said, "You didn't hear anything?" And I thought, so who am I arguing with? And realized that, well, maybe God is calling me into this as much as I didn't really want to go.
Yeah.
So after that, my teacher of the missions course, he had that woman, the speaker, do another presentation at his house and invited our whole class. So this time I went and I watched the slides all over again, but this time I had a lot of questions.
Okay.
So that...
God's like, here, you want to do over?
Yeah, exactly.
So now you're looking at those slides thinking, oh, what if that was my light? Maybe.
Yeah, I'm trying not to get too scared about all of that.
Okay.
But that summer, I did start one of the courses, the training for Wycliffe, and decided while I was there that I would go through the process to become a member. And that summer of training, actually, the woman who did the speaking, she was one of my teachers at the summer school. And so at the end of the summer, when they had a new member reception, she was telling people that she had 100% recruitment from one of her meetings.
1 of 1 makes 100%.
That's enough. Yeah, so, eventually I felt led. I did always think Asia, but I got to know some people that summer that were working in Thailand, and so eventually I did go to Thailand and started on actually Bible translation first, and did that for many years. But because my undergraduate degree was in psychology, early on I kept thinking about, I wonder if I could use those skills in this context, because initially when I joined, I didn't have any concept of counselors being needed in missions.
Okay.
So I didn't even consider that option. But once I was in it, of course, I realized, of course, we need counselors. So even from my first furlough, I started asking around about what it would take to become a counselor in missions. But it took many years before I felt like God was releasing me from the translation project to pursue that.
But it sounds like, too, those years of being the missionary yourself probably was very shaping in your own life.
Yeah, huge for becoming a counselor, to have had the experience, to have gone through my own loneliness and depression, and to be able to really be able to empathize with what people are going through. Yeah, absolutely.
Your experiences in missions has given you the heart to be able to speak to those that are also in missions as well.
And for me, as someone who didn't always have a dream and excitement about going into missions, I think it's helpful too to know, this wasn't something I naturally was good at or skilled for. It was something that was actually fearful. And so I can identify with people struggling in that context as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if I understand right, your initial translation work was happening in Thailand?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And were you located in a larger city, in a smaller village? What was happening in Thailand?
Yeah, both, actually. I mean, I initially lived in Bangkok for several months to do language study, pretty big city. And then moved to Chiang Mai, and the way that we operated there was that we taught in a university training local translators and then doing translation ourselves the other half of the year. So yeah, I was doing translation work in a village part of the year, and then living in a city and teaching at a university part of the year.
So you were kind of living in both worlds at the same time.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that you loved about that season of your life living and working in Thailand? And what are some of the challenges?
Yeah, actually I think those two very much were connected because, like I say, I never saw myself as competent for this kind of work. I really was a homebody. And so for me to go to this little village, and after my first term, I went alone even. And so it was the most difficult thing that I've ever done. It was just hard in so many ways. And yet I remember one time very distinctly being on the back of a motorcycle taxi with my stuff going into the village and thinking, oh, I can't believe I'm doing this again. But suddenly having this sense of God, Emmanuel, is with me. Wow. I'm not going into this village alone. Mm. And even maybe more relevant would be to say, I'm going with him. Mm-hmm. And to have him so much more tangible and real because of the hardships, I would say is the thing that I love the most about my having lived overseas, is that I have experienced God in ways I could have never imagined possible because of all of those hard times.
So your dependence on him
exactly
was greater because of your experience in Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you were saying there was that some of those challenges and some of those great experiences were two sides of the same coin. You have the challenge of being on your own sometimes and doing the translation. I can't imagine the translation work. I just know from talking to so many people, I mean, you're creating alphabets, you're teaching people to read, you're just talking and listening and trying to put on paper what people have said for hundreds of years, having never had it written down. And I can't imagine those challenges.
Yeah, I think for me it was even more that when I first went into this village, of course no one there spoke English. They didn't even speak Thai, so we didn't really have any language in common at first. And very quickly I wound up going alone. And it was not a Christian village. There were no Christians in the village. They weren't asking for translation work. They weren't really understanding why I was there. And so just that whole connection of how to relate to these people was a struggle.
So my understanding, though, is you started that work, but recently there's actually some great things to celebrate.
Yeah, the two aspects of my work in Thailand, training translators and my translation work, came together when one of my students took on the project, and he just completed the New Testament, and it was supposed to be dedicated in March, but COVID kind of canceled some of the celebrations. But yeah, it's been very exciting to see that the word is finally getting to this group of people.
So you were able to plant seeds.
Yeah.
Okay, Lynn, so after doing the translation work, and I think it was about 15 years that you were involved in translation work, you made the move to counseling for missionaries. So let's talk a little bit about that transition and how all that came to be.
Mm. Yeah, like I said, I early on in my time overseas, I really wanted to get back to that, you might say, first love of psychology and doing counseling work. And as I saw the need for it, I really wanted to go in that direction. But by this time I was so deep in a language project, I really prayed and prayed and prayed about that. And it wasn't till years later that I felt like God was saying, yes, it's okay, you can leave the translation project now. And so it was really wonderful because I had no idea how I would afford a graduate program, but Wheaton College had a wonderful scholarship program for missionaries that basically repaid all the tuition with 4 years of service overseas after the program.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, it was wonderful. It was considered a loan while I was doing the program, and then every year that I was overseas afterwards, 1/4 of it was forgiven.
Wow.
So that made it just absolutely wonderful. And Wheaton was a great place for me to be mentored and learn. I was really glad for that time. But like I say, I that really was my first love, so it was kind of more a matter of, oh yay, I finally get back to this, And so I was very glad that my administrators allowed me that time to go and do a study program and
So you were
return
still,
to the organization as a counselor.
so you were still with Wycliffe, but
Yeah.
you just shifted gears and they allowed you some training time. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you already knew you'd go overseas again, so it was a
Yeah.
kind of easy deal to get your loan paid off that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's
So,
great.
I was wondering, when you initially started into the counseling area, were you solely working with the with Wycliffe and other Wycliffe missionaries, or were you available to other missionaries in your area?
Mm-hmm. Well, after doing the study program, Wycliffe had a program called CDOC, Counselor, some kind of orientation. And so for a couple of years, as I was getting my hours for licensure, I was working at the Dallas headquarters, serving whoever, yes, it was the headquarters of Wycliffe, but there were a lot of students there. There were Pioneer Bible Translators was right across the street. So there were quite a variety of people around that used our services. So it wasn't solely for Wycliffe people, but that was a large part of our clientele. But my first assignment was as the Asia area counselor based in Manila. And so there I did a lot of traveling, being available to administrators, going to conferences, annual conferences of members, maybe doing some training, being available for short-term counseling, responding to crises. And so there, my boss actually, one time we got a request from another mission organization when there had been a helicopter crash. And my boss said, yeah, go. He was very gracious with time and resources to serve anyone that needed it.
So you were in that role serving out of Manila for how long?
3.5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
You probably saw the gamut doing that.
Oh my goodness. Yes, and that turned out to be a very exhausting time for me because so often I'd get a call from an administrator saying, hey, I've got this situation. And they didn't ask, what do I do? They would say, can you come and take care of it?
Come to put out the fire. I don't want to have to put out the fire.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So between going to conferences, responding to crises, responding to administrators' requests, I was traveling every month, and I got very burned out during that period.
I can imagine that was pretty exhausting. And you just even knowing how to do your own self-care in the midst of that was probably challenging.
Yes. I had a professor at Wheaton who talked about counselors serving a toilet function.
Oh, my.
Where you have to learn how to flush. And, all the things that you hear and deal with, especially in crises and all, you need to be able to handle that stuff well. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we're in the area there of primary and secondary trauma.
Yes.
Because
Definitely.
you were hearing things and experiencing things, and it hadn't happened to you, but you were taking it on because you were hearing it. And so that just begins to weigh on you.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Reminds me of, we got to interview Dr. Steve Tracy and talk about secondary trauma. So you're already touching on that. It's a real thing. Like you
Very
were
much so.
serving missionaries, helping care for them, but it was affecting you and your emotional and physical health and all that.
Yeah.
Wow. So what made you want to, was that burnout feeling what made you want to switch gears and start CarePort, or how did CarePort come about?
Yeah. Well, when I came back from Asia, after the Asia area job, I was burned out, exhausted. I wound up having chronic fatigue syndrome. I was really spending time in recovery myself and taking a while to do that. I mean, I didn't even go back to work for 6 months. And during that time, I would occasionally go to a retreat place, somewhat similar to Sanctuary Inn, actually, but this was years ago. And it was at that place when I sensed that God was putting this vision in my head, heart, whatever. And it was similar to when I started missions. I was like, but God, you know the state I'm in right now. You want
me to do what?
Yeah, this sounds big, and I'm really exhausted. This seems way bigger than me, and of course it was. But he was encouraging me to do it, and every step that I took, I just tried not to look at the whole picture at once. But I started looking at, okay, what is this going to mean? It means starting a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It means incorporating a company. It means coming up with bylaws. It means creating a website. And I'm sure you're aware of all of these things that it takes.
Yeah.
Especially very...
All those things that I didn't know that I was going to be walking through one day.
Yes, exactly. And I was doing it on my own, and like I say, I didn't think I had what it took to do it, but as I did it, I would hit a wall with something. I'd be focusing on, applying for nonprofit status, and something would come up that just seemed like an impossible block to me. I don't know how we're going to get around this. And every time I hit a block like that, within 24 to 72 hours, God revealed the solution to get around it, to move forward. And it really is, again, like being in Thailand, thinking this is so hard, this is beyond me, and yet God was doing it, and it was very clearly God, because I did not have the capacity to do it, especially at that time. So it's such a encouragement to me and such a reminder to me of what God is able to do if we just let him do it and not look at our own resources or capacity.
Yeah, so his strength is perfect in your weakness.
Absolutely. And he keeps reminding me of that even as I continue to deal with chronic fatigue, is that it is not a limitation to him. And yes, his grace is sufficient.
So you've started CarePort, and then, I don't know, you had to put the word out, you had to let people know what you were doing, and make yourself available to people. Were you seeing people respond?
It took a while. I'm sure you've experienced this too. It took a while to get the word out. It took a while to develop, a full load of clients. But eventually it did. I got, of course, referred to by Wycliffe initially. I got the word out on a variety of mission networks, mission newsletters, etc. But it took some time, and it was definitely a walk by faith thing for me that I was leaving Wycliffe, and I lost a lot of support that had gone with Wycliffe, and so it was a real struggle for a while. But, God made it clear that he wanted this to happen, and he's been faithful in making it viable, making it work.
So you do online counseling. What made you want to do online counseling?
Yeah, good question. When I was working with Wycliffe and I had come back from Asia, I was working from the headquarters there, and sometimes I'd be doing counseling with someone and then they needed to, it was the end of their furlough and they needed to go back overseas. And we started doing some form of distance counseling. Initially, it was just doing emails back and forth, but as the technology became available, I thought, what a great way to continue serving people. And especially in starting CarePort, I thought, we in Wycliffe had so many resources. I mean, we still didn't feel like we had enough, but there really were a lot of counselors available to Wycliffe folks. And I thought, there's so many people out there that don't have those kind of resources. Either they're in a small organization or maybe they're just independent and they don't have resources. And it's such a big deal to have to pack up the whole family, leave the country, and get help. And so I really had a heart for making this kind of resource counseling available to people. And it was wonderful that the technology was making it possible.
So Lynn, when you do counseling online, do you feel like you have a connection with people? I mean, does it seem odd that you're not in a room with them face to face?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. For me, I don't feel that way. I do feel connected. I think people experience connection in quite a variety of ways, and everybody is different in that regard as to what really enhances connection for us. And so for some people it might be doing things together. For some it might be, who can I really share myself with? For some people it might be, any number of things. But for me, I don't mind working online, but I know that that's a question for my clients. Do they feel comfortable doing it this way? And nowadays there's more people that do counseling with missionaries, and so there's a variety of options out there. So if that's really important to someone, great. I mean, I hope they can find the resources that they need. But a lot of times I find people that they're so desperate for some help that they would gladly do it online.
And as you said, it allows them to stay where they are.
Yeah, it prevents the whole big life upheaval, and they can continue. Yeah. So, and what I find with both the connection issue, but also like doing this using technology, being on a screen, some places don't have that great a connection still. They're used to it.
Uh-huh.
They're used to having to cope with this poor connection, to talk with people, to communicate with family, with whoever. And so they tend to be able to deal with that better. And I think initially it might be somewhat of an issue, but I think as people experience that there is someone who listens, who takes an interest in every detail of their life, who shows empathy, that connection forms, even though it may not be in the best of environments.
Yeah, and in some ways you're a lifeline to them in a situation where maybe they wouldn't have had any help.
Yeah, that's the thing. If they don't have options, online is fine.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say you have learned about missionary care in your years as a missionary care professional?
Well, I would have to say, Cara, that the one thing that I have learned is we all need it. I mean, that's the bottom line, is that we all need to be loved, cared for, accepted, nurtured. And some people had that very well growing up, and they can hold on to that and have good resilience from it. And others, it's much harder. And when you face the stressors of living in another culture, it just is really important that there are people that will listen and have compassion and care about what they're experiencing.
Yeah.
You touched on a word there. You mentioned the word resilience, and I've heard resilience used before. Just talk a minute about that word and how you understand that word in the missionary context.
Yeah, interesting. It's certainly a word that's bounced around a lot, and I know there are people that do really good work on researching what are the factors that contribute to resiliency and have done a lot of hard work to explore that further. For me, in my experience in counseling missionaries particularly, I think of it as having a lot to do with the strength of our foundation in being rooted and grounded in God's love. How much is that a reality to our life? Not only rooted and grounded in God's love, but rooted and grounded in loving connection with other people as well. And if we have those loving connections, it really helps us to deal with whatever we may face.
Okay.
You just painted a picture for me of like a tree that has deep roots. And you're saying you have deep roots in Christ and his love for us, and deep roots in relationship and friendships and family, and wherever we build those roots deep, when the storms come, that tree isn't going to fall over.
Yeah.
So.
And, as someone who was raised in a nominally Christian home and certainly had its struggles, I grew up in a fairly dysfunctional family, but, there's a lot of families out there like that just don't have that good, strong base of connection. And for those, they may have coped well in their home country, but once they go overseas, it's just a whole new level of stress that can really challenge the coping mechanisms.
The storms are bigger.
Yep.
What would you say is some of the most rewarding part of your work with missionaries?
I can say it in one word: transformation. To me, it is the most thrilling thing that I have ever seen in my life, is seeing people really get that connectedness, really understand God's love for them. Maybe they didn't have the best mom or dad model for that love and acceptance, but to see them grow in understanding what it looks like to be rooted and grounded in somebody's love and acceptance, it's just thrilling to me to see people come out of counseling and face life with a whole new perspective on themselves, on others, on God. And it's so beautiful. And I'm reminded with every one of how great God is at redemption. That's what he's in the business of, and he redeems all the yucky stuff from our past and transforms it. And it's so beautiful.
You get to be in a front row seat.
Yes.
To watch God at work in someone's life.
Yeah.
So we know from having been overseas or visiting and spending time with missionaries, I mean, you move overseas, your marriage and family, it's all a little bit more under pressure. You feel, there's language acquisition that's usually part of what's going on, and that's a whole nother pressure there. And then sometimes people are working in very isolated and remote areas, and that's a different kind of pressure. So are these the kinds of things that bring people to you, or are they just kind of part of the puzzle of what is really kind of urging someone on to say, hey, I really need to talk to someone?
Yeah, I think those things all contribute to the problem, but I don't typically see those as actually the whole picture. It's usually that somebody is at the end of their coping. They've reached the end of themselves, and they need somebody to help them move forward, get somewhere different. And they've probably tried a number of things, or the same thing over and over again, but
with the same bad results.
Yes. But they've reached the end of themselves, and they need help, whether it's depression, anxiety, stressed out, problems in relationships, getting so frustrated. They've gotten to this point where they can't manage anymore, And it's all those stressors that have contributed to it, but most likely there's some kind of underlying issue that has said, okay, they haven't built a good foundation on a lot of healthy coping mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So those are the things we typically need to work on. But all those events of being a missionary contribute to getting to that place.
Sure. Uh-huh.
So what would be some of the specific issues that missionaries come with?
Yeah, depression, anxiety, they feel burned out. Relationships with other people, with their teammates. Mm-hmm. They're having problems in communication. Like Steve mentioned, marriages as well. It's just getting too hard. Their communication isn't working. They're not resolving things. They're in the same argument over and over again.
Okay. So it's just a good reminder that those are good reasons to reach out for help if you find yourself in those situations. It's okay.
Yeah.
And a missionary isn't a superhuman. Missionaries do get depressed.
Yeah.
They do get
Absolutely.
They do get anxious. They do get fearful.
Lynn, how do you deal with missionaries that are really dealing with the stigma of I need help? We've talked about this with other guests before, but there is an attitude somewhere in the missions community, in some parts of the mission community, that missionaries don't need help, that they're fine, they'll be okay. But and then so some people can feel awkward reaching out for help. How do you? What happens when those conversations come up?
Yeah, that usually happens before they reach me. I don't necessarily see that. But yes, I've had people contact me, and even on the form they fill out saying, what is it that you want help with right now? They even say, well, it's hard to find a safe person. Or as a missionary, it's hard to find someone that I can really be honest and authentic with that isn't going to, either wonder why I'm serving overseas or maybe even some judgment about the problem that I'm having. And so it can be a real challenge. And sometimes I think that's why it's good to have something like CarePort that is both outside of their organization, outside of their church, someone who is neutral and hopefully not going to judge. And I think it helps that they see on my website that I've been overseas. I have that experience.
Yeah.
So if someone who's listening to our podcast today is struggling, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think, Steve, you hit the nail on the head that the big thing to do is ask for help, because that is such a challenge in itself, is getting to the point where you can ask for help. And not everyone will be able to. It may take asking a number of people until you find someone who really can be helpful or can point you in a direction of where you can get help. But to be persistent, because there is help out there. And if you cry out to God for it, He will bring resources, someone or something to help.
Yeah. And we've mentioned here on our podcast before that if people have questions and want to find resources, to email us. And we here at Sanctuary and love to resource people and help them find people like you and others. I know other counselors doing work online and counseling centers around the world. There are resources available.
Yeah, more than ever.
And just help people find the help they need.
So I know that missionaries go out generally, not always, but generally with family support and encouragement, and churches standing behind them and praying for them and encouraging them. But what is the role of family or churches in terms of encouraging their missionaries in taking care of themselves and being that advocate for the missionary when they find themselves in a situation where they do probably need some extra help?
I think that actually is the biggest thing, is being of a mindset that is looking for, does someone need to talk? Because that is a big one. And I even have clients who they may not even have major issues or a specific goal in mind, but they just need to process with someone. And so being aware that it is stressful and people may need to just talk, I think a lot of times when people think of helping others, they think of, well, I wouldn't know what to say, or I don't know how to help someone. And actually having advice, having specific things that you have to get it right to help them is not even really so much the issue. I think a lot of times what is the most helpful is being willing to walk with, to just say, I'm here with you. I'm here. I'm open. I'm ready to listen. And like we sort of hinted at earlier, that whole idea of just not communicating any kind of judgment, criticism, but really being open to, if somebody is struggling, okay, I want to hear about it, rather than somehow thinking, well, you shouldn't be struggling, or, what are you doing there if you're struggling? But to, I think listening is the biggest thing. And like I say, being able to journey with people in this life is a huge skill.
Yeah. So that people feel heard and known and cared for.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the talk you gave at Mission Connection, of the power of being heard. Mm-hmm. And I think we can connect in our show notes and on our website to that presentation you did about how people can stop and listen and really care for their missionary in that way.
Mm-hmm. And so often, when you're working overseas, if you're having struggle with your teammates, you may not have those to go to talk to. You don't have extended family around. Mm-hmm. If you want to do it in your native tongue, you may not be able to do it with any of your local friends. Mm-hmm. And so just having somebody to be able to process with can be a huge service.
Yeah.
And I think you can speak to this, but I believe, I'm aware that other nations, other countries, other nationalities are raising up counselors in their, in their field, in their areas, so that people, like you were saying, in their mother tongue, people have counselors that they can speak to in their mother tongue. And so God is raising up these men and women around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a relatively new thing, and certainly people are working to really increase that around the world. Yeah.
Because there are missionaries from every country to every country these days.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is a growing area. I think 100, 200 years behind the launch of missions and from the West.
Yeah.
And so now we're really kind of... So then the rest of the world is getting on the bandwagon, So maybe they're not too far behind.
Yeah, and that's one of our biggest challenges in the whole area of missionary care is trying to make resources available and training for Brazilians and Mexicans and people from Central America and people from Asia that are training and sending missionaries. And then how do they care for those missionaries? And so that's a whole another area that we really want to be involved in, and Sanctuary Inn wants to be part of supporting and encouraging those networks. And we're just trusting that God is going to open those doors for us too.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's so good to hear your story. I got to hear some parts of your story I didn't know. And
my pleasure.
And just to hear your heart for caring for missionaries. And I love it that you get to do what you love, sitting in your home and caring for missionaries literally around the world. So that's really awesome.
So just a reminder that if you want to communicate with Sanctuary Inn, you can reach out to us at sanctuaryinn.org. Or if you want to reach out to Lynn, you can find her at careportcounseling.org. And you can at least start a conversation there, and Lynn can give you more information about that. But Sanctuary Inn also wants to be a resource for you and to be able to refer you or be maybe a starting point in your journey if you're looking for someone to talk to. So again, Lynn, thanks so much for your time.
Mm-hmm. Welcome.
So Steve, what did you hear that struck you up out of our conversation with Lynn today?
Well, it was interesting to hear Lynn's story and her background and starting in engineering and ending up in psychology. That's a kind of a fascinating shift of focus for her. But you can see how God used that in her life, and her going to Thailand and doing Bible translation, how all that, all the training she had has been so significant. And I think a translator's mind and an engineer's mind probably are pretty much the same mind. All the attention to detail and the perseverance, the patience to stay with a project like a translation project. So I think just hearing more of her story and was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I love that as she told that part of her story of being, that single woman in this tiny village in Thailand and not really feeling adequate to the job or feeling pretty alone and isolated. And just, I love that beautiful story of how she sensed God's presence with her. And it seems like that's been a theme in her life of, she doesn't always feel like she's up to the job that God asked her to do. Yeah, God gets glorified because he's the one that gives her the strength and the energy and the resources to do what he asked her to do.
Yeah, it's just fascinating to listen back and to think about how Lynn really wasn't looking for a career in missions, and she goes to a meeting and she's basically the only guest.
100% recruitment.
100% recruitment, yeah. So Lynn goes to that meeting and she hears a story and starts hearing about a need, and then God just kind of keeps bringing that back to her through several different avenues. And then eventually she's like, well, maybe this is something I should consider.
And she planted a seed. She
Yeah.
didn't get to see the end of that work, of that translation work.
Yeah, her faithfulness in the translation work and in the discipleship, because it was her discipleship of another young man that he carried on that translation work and oversaw it and brought that to the fruition. And I know earlier this year, Lynn was supposed to be in Thailand to celebrate that unveiling, as it were, of that New Testament, and that wasn't able to happen. But anyway,
But the people still have the Bible.
They still have the Bible.
They still have the New Testament,
Yeah,
even despite COVID mess.
That's right.
They still have God's Word now, and what an amazing testimony that is.
Yeah.
And she learned so much, too, about how people need support and help in those hard places.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and we didn't even really get into the whole conversation about how people are responding right now in the midst of a lot of extra crisis and so on, because we know we've had several guests come through Sanctuary in the summer that have had sudden and dramatic changes in their life and ministry because of what's happening with COVID around the world.
Yeah, and I just love it that she's, working with CarePort, and she's already poised and ready to be a help to people online.
Yeah.
And I know that she just really loves that work. And it was cool to hear her just light up today as she was talking about the transformation that she gets to witness in people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah, so Lynn being doing that counseling online, there's no place she can't go. I mean, as long as there's an internet connection of some sort, it doesn't even have to be a great internet connection. She can connect with someone and have a conversation. And I appreciated hearing Lynn talk about some of the different things that bring people to her. And so I asked her that question about language and marriage and culture. And those are often a lot of things that are just like superficial or external stresses. But a lot of times they reveal maybe something that's of greater significance that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I loved her picture of how it's our rootedness.
Mm-hmm.
And these other things are like the storm.
Yeah.
And they expose how deep your roots are.
Right.
If language and culture stresses and all those challenges are really exposing how deep are your roots in connection with the Lord and with others, and sometimes you might need some help in building down those roots deeper and growing. And I think that's what she just loves to do in her work. And if any of you are needing that extra support and help, I'd encourage you to reach out to Lynn or to us and get help, or whoever you know, and get help. That was just really encouraging to hear.
Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to ask and say, hey, I need someone to talk to. And like Lynn said, a lot of times it's just someone to talk to. It's not necessarily that it's a traumatic event or you're spending months and years in counseling. Sometimes you just need someone to talk to and you need to process some information. So again, you can reach Lynn at careportcounseling.org, or you can reach us here at Sanctuary Inn at www.sanctuaryinn.org.
And my email is Kara, Kara, at sanctuaryinn.org. And Steve?
I'm just Steve at sanctuaryinn.org, and so reach out to us if you have some questions or you want to get connected with someone that you can talk to. Again, thanks for taking the time to listen to the Innkeepers podcast today, and we trust that God will bless your day.
See you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers for kingdom purposes. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, and maybe you were prompted to pass this along to someone you know that will benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy schedules to help us learn more about missionary care.
We also want to thank Tim Downing for the music that he wrote and performed specifically for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can learn more about him and his work at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos and is produced by Tim Cowley of Cowley Visuals. If you have media needs, including film, photography, or audio, you can reach Tim at cowleyvisuals.com.
Our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Gibbons, Cara's amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website and learn more about the ministry of Sanctuary Inn at sanctuaryinn.org. Thank you again for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.
See you next time.